let's go to The Age and over down in Melbourne. This beautiful photo of the two little ones back to school. Preps are delighted to be back in the classroom after 74 days away. I cannot even imagine, poor parents and those little ones. But a really interesting yarn that I really want to get your take on, Matt, obviously because you have obviously a vested interest in this area. The national laws on sacred sites have been urged. A federal inquiry investigating Rio Tinto's destruction of the 46,000-year-old Juukan Gorge rock shelters has called for a national law to protect Indigenous heritage and new powers for traditional owners to refuse projects that threaten significant sites on their ancestral land. This yarn obviously made absolute storm in WA, Matt. What do you think about the potential to have an overarching federal body to look after these, ancient heritage sites that must be protected?
Well, I agree that the sites need to be protected. I do have some issue with another body that is going to, perhaps be created to protect them, because there are already mechanisms in place to protect these sacred sites. Now, in the case of the Juukan Caves, of course, Rio Tinto, it was aware that they were there, but destroyed them anyway, right? So that is the issue. Rio Tinto absolutely did the wrong thing. Yeah, that's right. So they needed to be accountable, but of course they could only be held accountable after the fact. But I do think we need to be careful, Jenna, when it comes to standing in the way of development on Aboriginal land in this country. It is one thing that has held Aboriginal people back in the Northern Territory for a long, long time. There are so many hoops that need to be jumped through in many cases to get that development up and running. And I think governments, the federal government in particular, needs to make economic development on Aboriginal land something that is easier to do, not harder to do. And that is why I would have some concern about what's being proposed here.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that the West Australian Government, the Aboriginal Heritage Act, it was a major pet project of former Treasurer Ben Wyatt and Aboriginal Affairs Minister Ben Wyatt, and he never got to get that legislation through to repair it and fix all those loopholes. So fingers crossed that the local governments and the state governments at least can have those mechanisms in place to protect things from this ever happening again in the short term. Over to the Sydney Morning Herald now, and the splash is all about domestic violence. 480 million to build 75 women's refuges. It's a great story by Alexandra Smith. The New South Wales Government will make its single largest investment in tackling domestic violence, spending almost $500 million on extra refuges for women and children fleeing their homes. The spending will form a big part of the state government's COVID-19 economic recovery package and will add 75 women's refuges, taking the number to New South Wales to 161. I guess at the end of the day, you can't have emergency accommodation quick enough in these times. But I guess I'd love to see what the governments around the country and also the federal government are going to do about the prevention of this behaviour that forces women and children to flee their homes in the first place. What do you think, Matt?
Well, absolutely. I think it's a great initiative by the New South Wales Government, but you hit the nail on the head with that point that you raised, because one of the biggest issues, as we know, is that often the woman and the child who flee domestic violence are the ones who end up homeless, while the perpetrator of the domestic violence ends up with the house, and that's, we see that happen here quite a bit in the NT, and I'm sure it happens, all around the country. So, good on the New South Wales Government for that massive investment in this much-needed accommodation. But I think it is the sort of accommodation that really is necessary, because, if not having a place to stay, a home to live in, is a barrier for a woman or children who need to escape an abusive relationship, well, that's not good enough and shouldn't happen. So I think big tick to the New South Wales Government for this one.